In the heart of East Texas, where cotton fields stretch endlessly toward horizons painted amber by October sunsets, sits Millerville, a town so small that everyone knows everyone, and secrets are supposed to be impossible to keep. Population 847, according to the weathered sign that greets visitors on Highway 287, though locals joke it might be generous by 100 souls or so. The kind of place where the high school football games draw half the town on Friday nights, where the Methodist and Baptist churches compete more fiercely over their annual bake sales than any theological differences, and where leaving your doors unlocked isn't just common, it's expected. Sarah Beth Morrison embodied everything Millerville cherished about itself. At 23, she possessed that rare combination of small-town sweetness and genuine intelligence that made her equally beloved by the 6-year-olds in her second-grade classroom and the weathered farmers who tipped their hats when she passed on Main Street. Her laugh had a way of carrying across the town square during the lunch hour when she'd walk to Pauline's diner for her usual chicken salad sandwich and sweet tea. The kind of laugh that made people stop their conversations just to smile in her direction. Sarah Beth had been teaching at Millerville Elementary for 2 years, having returned home after completing her education degree at Sam Houston State. She could have taken positions in Dallas or Houston. Her grades were stellar, her recommendations glowing, but Sarah Beth Morrison was homegrown through and through. She rented a small apartment above Hartley's hardware store, drove a powder blue 1994 Honda Civic that her father had helped her buy, and spent her weekends helping her mother, Linda, tend to the flower beds at the town's small cemetery. October 12, 1996, dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes Texans remember why they love their state despite the brutal summers. The annual Millerville County Fair was in full swing, transforming the usually quiet fairgrounds into a carnival of cotton candy. Carnival rides that had seen better decades, and the intoxicating smell of funnel cakes mixed with livestock from the 4-H competitions. Sarah Beth had spent the day volunteering at the school's booth, helping second graders navigate their art projects and ensuring every child who wanted a balloon animal received one from old Mr. Henderson, who'd been twisting balloons at the fair for as long as anyone could remember. As evening approached and the Ferris wheel lights began to twinkle against the darkening sky, Sarah Beth made her rounds, saying goodbye to the families she'd spent the day with. Mrs. Patterson from the bank later recalled Sarah Beth, mentioning she was tired but happy, ready to head home and grade papers for Monday morning. Several witnesses saw her walking toward the gravel parking lot around 8:30, her car keys jingling in her hand, a slight smile still playing on her lips from something one of her students had said about the pig races. That was the last time anyone in Millerville saw Sarah Beth Morrison alive. If you subscribe to our channel and stay with us, you'll understand why this single moment, a young teacher walking to her car after a perfect day, would haunt this community for nearly 3 decades. Dawn on October 15th arrived grey and mournful, nothing like the brilliant sunshine that had blessed the county fair 3 days earlier. The temperature had dropped overnight, and a persistent drizzle turned the dirt roads around Millerville into ribbons of rust-colored mud. It was Jimmy Patterson, no relation to the bank's Mrs. Patterson, who made the discovery that would shatter the town's innocence forever. Jimmy was 16, a junior at Millerville High who'd been hunting rabbits along Willow Creek since he was old enough to safely carry his grandfather's .22 rifle. The creek wound through the Morrison family's old property, a tract of land that had been in Sarah Beth's family for generations, but had gone mostly unused since her grandfather's death 5 years earlier. Thick stands of post oak and mesquite created natural corridors along the water, perfect hiding spots for the cottontails that Jimmy's grandmother loved to fry up for Sunday dinner. He almost missed her entirely. The body lay partially submerged in a shallow bend of the creek, caught against a fallen log that had probably been there since the last major flood. From a distance, Jimmy later told investigators he thought it might be an old tarp, or maybe a discarded sleeping bag that someone had illegally dumped. It wasn't until he got within 20 feet that he saw the unmistakable shape of a human form, the pale skin stark against the dark water and autumn leaves. Jimmy would never forget the sound of his own voice screaming Sarah Beth's name across the empty countryside, though he wouldn't remember making the decision to call out to her. Some part of his teenage brain refused to accept what his eyes were telling him, clinging to the desperate hope that somehow their beloved teacher had simply fallen asleep by the creek, that she would sit up and laugh at his panic. Ask him what in the world he was doing out there making such a commotion. Sheriff Tom Rawlings received the call at 7:23 a.m., his coffee growing cold as Jimmy's father's voice crackled through the radio, barely coherent through grief and shock. Rawlings had been sheriff of Millerville County for 18 years, had seen his share of farm accidents, car wrecks, and the occasional domestic dispute that turned violent. But nothing had prepared him for what he found at Willow Creek. Sarah Beth Morrison had been brutally murdered. The coroner would later determine she'd been struck multiple times with a blunt object, though the creek water had washed away much of the physical evidence that might have pointed investigators toward her killer. Her clothes were torn but still partially in place, suggesting the attack had been frenzied rather than methodical. Most disturbing of all, her wedding ring finger had been severed, though Sarah Beth had never been married, and the finger was never found. What struck Sheriff Rawlings immediately was the location itself. Willow Creek was nearly 4 miles from the fairgrounds, down roads that a stranger to Millerville would never think to travel. Whoever had brought Sarah Beth here knew the area intimately, knew that the creek bed would be deserted even on a busy weekend, knew exactly where to hide a body in the vast expanse of East Texas countryside. The news spread through Millerville like wildfire through dry grass. By noon, the fairgrounds where Sarah Beth had spent her last happy hours were empty, the carnival rides standing motionless against the grey sky like monuments to innocence lost. The community that had spent 3 days searching desperately for their missing teacher now faced a horrifying reality. Sarah Beth Morrison hadn't simply vanished into the night. Someone among them, someone who knew their roads, their hiding places, their secrets, had taken her life with unspeakable violence. Sheriff Tom Rawlings had investigated exactly 3 homicides in his 18 years of law enforcement, and 2 of those had been domestic disputes, where the perpetrator was still standing over the body when deputies arrived. The third was a bar fight gone wrong in 1989 that took exactly 48 hours to solve, because the killer had bragged about it to half the county before anyone thought to call the sheriff's office. None of that experience had prepared him for Sarah Beth Morrison. The Millerville County Sheriff's Department consisted of Rawlings, 2 full-time deputies, and a part-time dispatcher who also ran the town's small library. Their annual budget wouldn't cover a week's worth of investigation costs in Dallas, and their evidence storage facility was a converted supply closet in the basement of the courthouse. When the Texas Department of Public Safety offered assistance, Rawlings swallowed his small-town pride and accepted immediately, knowing this case was beyond anything his department had ever handled. Detective Maria Santos from the DPS arrived within hours, a compact woman in her 40s whose calm professionalism stood in stark contrast to the emotional chaos consuming Millerville. She established a command post in the courthouse conference room, spreading crime scene photographs and evidence bags across the scarred wooden table where the county commissioners usually debated road maintenance budgets. The transformation was jarring. Suddenly, this sleepy government building hummed with the urgent energy of a major criminal investigation. The initial suspect list seemed straightforward enough. Danny Reeves, Sarah Beth's ex-boyfriend from college, had shown up at the county fair unexpectedly, claiming he'd driven down from Dallas just to surprise her. Several witnesses remembered seeing them talking near the cotton candy stand, their conversation appearing tense. Danny had left town immediately after Sarah Beth's disappearance was reported, returning to Dallas without speaking to anyone about their encounter. When detectives tracked him down, his story kept changing. First he claimed they'd barely spoken, then admitted they'd argued about his desire to reconcile. Then there was the drifter. A man in his 30s had been seen around town for several days before the fair, sleeping rough near the railroad tracks and asking for odd jobs. Jake Whitman, who owned the gas station, remembered the stranger asking detailed questions about local families, particularly single women. The man had vanished the same night Sarah Beth disappeared, leaving behind only a torn sleeping bag and empty beer cans near the old grain elevator. But it was the third piece of evidence that kept Detective Santos awake at night, staring at the courthouse ceiling from the cramped motel room she'd rented for the duration of the investigation. Sarah Beth's car keys had been found by a jogger 4 miles from the fairgrounds, lying in the tall grass beside Farm Road 1847. The location made no sense. It was completely off any logical route between the fair and Sarah Beth's apartment, and even further from Willow Creek, where her body was discovered. The keys weren't just dropped randomly. They'd been placed deliberately on a specific fence post, balanced carefully so they wouldn't fall into the weeds below. Someone wanted them found, but not immediately. The fence post belonged to the Henderson property, the same family whose patriarch had been making balloon animals at the fair for decades. When questioned, old Mr. Henderson seemed genuinely bewildered, insisting he'd never seen the keys before and couldn't imagine why anyone would leave them on his land. Detective Santos walked that stretch of road repeatedly, trying to understand the killer's logic. The placement suggested intimate knowledge of local geography. Whoever put those keys there knew exactly which properties belonged to which families, knew the morning jogging routes of Millerville's residents, knew that fence post would be visible from the road but not obvious enough to be discovered quickly. This wasn't the work of a passing stranger or a crime of sudden passion. This was calculated, methodical, personal. As October faded into November and the first cold front swept across East Texas, the investigation began to consume the town's daily rhythm. Neighbors eyed each other with new suspicion, wondering who among them might be capable of such brutality. The Methodist Church's Wednesday night suppers became informal forums for sharing theories and rumors, while the Baptist congregation held increasingly fervent prayer meetings, begging God to reveal the killer's identity. By Christmas of 1996, the Sarah Beth Morrison case had generated over 200 pages of reports, witness statements, and forensic analysis. Yet Detective Santos felt no closer to identifying the killer than she had on that first gray morning at Willow Creek. The investigation had methodically eliminated every obvious suspect, leaving behind a frustrating collection of dead ends and unanswered questions that seemed to mock the very notion of small-town justice. Danny Reeves, the ex-boyfriend from Dallas, had passed a polygraph examination and provided a solid alibi for the crucial hours after Sarah Beth's disappearance. Security cameras at a Dallas convenience store showed him purchasing gas and cigarettes at 11:47 p.m. on October 12th, making it physically impossible for him to have been anywhere near Millerville during the estimated time of death. His emotional breakdown during the polygraph had been genuine grief, not guilty knowledge. The last words he'd spoken to Sarah Beth had been harsh ones, and he would carry that regret for the rest of his life. The drifter proved even more elusive, but for different reasons. After weeks of investigation, Detective Santos had traced him to 3 other small towns across East Texas, where he'd followed the same pattern, appearing suddenly, asking questions about local women, then vanishing without explanation. His real name was Walter Kowalski, a former oil field worker from Louisiana, with a history of petty theft and public intoxication, but no record of violence. When authorities finally located him in a Shreveport homeless shelter, Kowalski's mental state had deteriorated significantly. His rambling accounts of the weeks he'd spent in Millerville contained obvious fabrications and impossible timelines, the confused narratives of a man whose grip on reality had been compromised by years of alcohol abuse and untreated mental illness. More troubling was the forensic evidence, or rather, the lack of it. The creek water had washed away most traces that might have pointed towards Sarah Beth's killer, but what remained told a story that made Detective Santos deeply uncomfortable. The crime scene suggested someone with enough knowledge to avoid leaving obvious clues. No fingerprints on items that should have retained them, no clear footprint impressions despite the soft ground around the creek. No witnesses despite the victim being moved from the fairgrounds to a location 4 miles away. The severed finger haunted the investigation. The clean nature of the cut suggested someone with experience handling sharp tools, possibly medical or veterinary training, though interviews with every doctor, nurse, and veterinarian within a 50-mile radius yielded nothing useful. The finger's absence felt symbolic, ritualistic in a way that spoke to deeper psychological motivations than a simple robbery or assault gone wrong. As winter settled over Millerville, the daily rhythm of the investigation began to slow. Detective Santos returned to Austin, leaving behind boxes of evidence and a promise to Sheriff Rawlings that the case would remain active. But everyone understood the reality of small-town law enforcement. Without fresh leads or witnesses, the Sarah Beth Morrison murder would inevitably be relegated to a filing cabinet, another unsolved case in Texas's long catalogue of rural mysteries. Linda Morrison refused to accept this fate for her daughter's memory. Sarah Beth's mother had transformed from a quiet woman who preferred tending her garden to a relentless advocate who appeared at every county commissioner meeting, every sheriff's department budget hearing, every opportunity to keep her daughter's case in the public eye. She organized annual vigils at Willow Creek, maintained detailed files of every piece of evidence, and pestered successive sheriffs with new theories and forgotten details. The town's initial unity began to fracture under the weight of unresolved grief and suspicion. Neighbors who had once borrowed tools without asking now locked their sheds. The annual county fair was cancelled in 1997, the fairgrounds standing empty as October arrived again. The Ferris wheel's skeleton a stark reminder of the last place Sarah Beth Morrison had been seen alive. Parents drove their children to school rather than letting them walk, and the easy trust that had defined Millerville's character became another casualty of that terrible autumn night. Sheriff Rawlings would retire in 2003, carrying the weight of Sarah Beth's unsolved murder as his greatest professional failure. On his last day in office, he stood in the courthouse basement, staring at the boxes of evidence that had yielded no answers, wondering if the killer had been someone he'd shaken hands with at church, someone whose children he'd taught to fish, someone who had helped search for Sarah Beth, while knowing exactly where she lay beneath the dark waters of Willow Creek. Linda Morrison became a woman possessed, though she would have bristled at such a description. In her mind, she was simply doing what any mother would do, refusing to let her daughter's memory fade into the comfortable amnesia that small towns use to heal from trauma. While Millerville gradually returned to its rhythms of Friday night football games and Sunday morning services, Linda maintained a vigil that would span nearly 3 decades, transforming her grief into a relentless pursuit of justice that both inspired and exhausted everyone around her. The transformation began gradually. In the months following Sarah Beth's funeral, Linda had seemed to be coping as well as anyone could expect. She returned to her job at the county clerk's office, maintained her flower beds, even managed to smile during conversations about anything other than her daughter. But those who knew her best noticed the changes. The way she would stop mid-sentence when something reminded her of the case, the manila folders that began appearing in her purse and car, the methodical way she started cataloging every detail of the investigation. By 1998, Linda's dining room had been converted into what looked like a private detective's office. The walls were covered with maps of Millerville County, photographs from the crime scene, and a detailed timeline she'd constructed from witness statements and police reports. She'd taught herself the basics of forensic science, subscribed to law enforcement journals, and built relationships with retired detectives across Texas who were willing to review cold cases during their spare time. Her Christmas wish lists consisted entirely of books about criminal investigation techniques and copies of similar unsolved cases from other jurisdictions. The annual vigils at Willow Creek became Linda's most visible crusade. Every October 15th, she would drive to the creek where Sarah Beth's body had been found, setting up a small memorial with fresh flowers, photographs of her daughter, and handwritten appeals for anyone with information to come forward. The first few years drew substantial crowds, classmates from high school, former students, church members who felt compelled to show support. But as time passed and no new developments emerged, attendance dwindled to a faithful core of family members and a few close friends who understood that abandoning Linda would be like abandoning Sarah Beth herself. What sustained Linda through the darkest periods was her unwavering belief that someone in Millerville knew more than they were telling. She had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense evasion, to detect the slight hesitation in someone's voice when Sarah Beth's name came up in conversation. At the grocery store, the post office, church functions, Linda watched and listened with the intensity of a trained investigator, filing away inconsistencies and half-remembered details that others dismissed as meaningless. Her marriage to Robert Morrison became a casualty of this obsession, though neither of them would have characterized it that way at the time. Robert grieved differently, inwardly, believing that dwelling on the details of their daughter's murder was preventing Linda from healing. He wanted to honor Sarah Beth's memory by living fully, by finding joy again despite their loss. Linda interpreted this as betrayal, as if moving forward meant abandoning their daughter to the indifference of an imperfect justice system. Their conversations became increasingly strained, punctuated by long silences, and the unspoken accusation that one of them was failing Sarah Beth's memory. The divorce in 2004 was quiet and amicable, processed through the same courthouse where Linda had spent countless hours reviewing case files and badgering successive sheriffs for updates. Robert moved to Austin, unable to live any longer in a town where every corner held reminders of what they'd lost. Linda remained, inheriting the house where Sarah Beth had grown up, converting her daughter's old bedroom into an archive of evidence and correspondence with law enforcement agencies across the country. She became a fixture at county commissioner meetings, sheriff's department budget hearings, and any other forum where she could advocate for resources to be devoted to cold cases. Her presentations were always meticulously prepared, filled with statistics about solve rates for old murders and examples of cases that had been cracked decades after going cold. Some officials found her tiresome, a grieving mother who couldn't accept that some questions would never be answered. Others recognized her expertise. By 2010, Linda Morrison knew more about investigative techniques and forensic developments than many active law enforcement officers. Her network expanded beyond Millerville County as she reached out to families dealing with similar losses, sharing resources and strategies for keeping cold cases active. She attended conferences for victims' families, learned about new DNA testing techniques, and maintained correspondence with detectives in other jurisdictions who had successfully solved old murders. Through online forums and support groups, she connected with mothers in California, Michigan, and Florida who understood the peculiar combination of hope and desperation that defined her daily existence. Sheriff Amanda Mitchell arrived in Millerville County in January 2019 with the kind of resume that made longtime residents wonder why someone with her qualifications would want the job. At 38, she had spent 15 years with the Texas Rangers, specializing in cold case investigations and forensic technology. Her appointment represented a generational shift in local law enforcement. Where previous sheriffs had relied on personal relationships and intuitive policing, Mitchell brought systematic approaches and access to investigative resources that hadn't existed when Sarah Beth Morrison was murdered. One of Mitchell's first acts was to inventory the department's evidence storage, a task that revealed the extent to which previous administrations had been overwhelmed by the complexities of modern forensic science. The basement of the courthouse contained dozens of boxes from unsolved cases dating back to the 1970s, many of them improperly stored and degraded by time and moisture. The Sarah Beth Morrison evidence occupied an entire metal shelving unit, Linda Morrison's persistent advocacy having ensured that nothing was ever discarded or overlooked. Mitchell understood immediately that the Morrison case represented both an opportunity and a responsibility. The evidence had been carefully preserved, the witness statements were comprehensive, and the investigation had been conducted with unusual thoroughness for a small-town department in the 1990s. More importantly, biological evidence from the crime scene had been collected and stored properly, waiting for forensic technology to advance enough to provide answers that had been impossible 23 years earlier. The decision to submit Sarah Beth's case for DNA analysis through the Texas Department of Public Safety's Cold Case Initiative wasn't made lightly. The backlog for such testing often stretched for months, and Mitchell knew that raising Linda Morrison's hopes without results would be cruel. But the evidence samples met the criteria for advanced testing, and the anniversary of Sarah Beth's murder was approaching. October 2019 would mark 23 years since that terrible night at the county fair. Mitchell drove to Linda Morrison's house on a Thursday afternoon in September, carrying the paperwork that would officially reopen the investigation using modern forensic techniques. She found Linda in her backyard garden, tending to the same flower beds that had provided comfort for more than 2 decades. At 69, Linda retained the sharp intelligence and determined energy that had sustained her crusade. Though the years of disappointment had left their mark in the careful way she approached any discussion of new developments in her daughter's case. The conversation in Linda's kitchen lasted 3 hours, with Mitchell explaining the DNA testing process and the realistic timelines they were facing. The samples would be processed through the combined DNA index system, known as CODIS, which maintained profiles from convicted offenders, crime scenes, and missing persons across the country. If Sarah Beth's killer had been arrested for any crime that required DNA sampling, or if similar biological evidence had been collected from other crime scenes, the system would identify potential matches. What Mitchell couldn't prepare Linda for was the waiting. The samples were submitted in October 2019, but the COVID-19 pandemic severely disrupted laboratory operations across the country. Months passed with no updates, then a year, then longer. Linda's patience, honed by decades of disappointment, was tested again as she watched other cold cases receive attention, while Sarah Beth's evidence sat in a laboratory queue somewhere in Austin. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March 2024, while Linda was having coffee and reviewing her correspondence with other victims' families. Sheriff Mitchell's voice was carefully controlled, professional in the way that law enforcement officers learn to modulate their emotions when delivering life-changing information. The DNA analysis had produced a match in the CODIS database. After 28 years, they had identified Sarah Beth Morrison's killer. But Mitchell's next words would shatter everything Linda thought she knew about her daughter's murder and the community that had harbored this secret for nearly 3 decades. The DNA profile belonged to someone Linda knew, someone who had been part of the search efforts, someone who had offered comfort to the Morrison family during their darkest hours, someone whose presence at Sarah Beth's funeral now took on a sinister new meaning. The name Mitchell spoke belonged to a man who had spent the past 28 years living openly in Millerville, raising his family, serving his community, and maintaining the carefully constructed facade of a man who had nothing to hide. The revelation would force everyone who had known him to reconsider every interaction, every conversation, every moment when they had trusted him with their children, their secrets, and their lives. Marcus Fielding had been making his morning coffee when Sheriff Mitchell's patrol car pulled into his driveway. The same ritual he'd followed for 37 years of marriage in the house on Elm Street, where he'd raised 3 children and watched 7 grandchildren take their first steps. At 67, Marcus moved with the deliberate care of a man who'd spent decades in physically demanding work, his hands still bearing the calluses, from his years as Millerville's volunteer fire chief and the small construction business he'd run until retirement. The badge on his kitchen table, a recognition award for 25 years of community service, caught the morning light as he watched Sheriff Mitchell walk up his front path. Marcus Fielding represented everything Millerville valued in its citizens. He had moved to town in 1987 with his young wife Carol, drawn by the promise of affordable land and the kind of community where children could grow up safely. He'd established himself quickly, volunteering for the fire department within months of arrival and demonstrating the kind of quiet competence that made him invaluable during emergencies. When the old fire chief retired in 1992, Marcus was the natural choice to replace him, a position he held with distinction until stepping down in 2010. His involvement in Sarah Beth Morrison's case had been both professional and personal. As fire chief, Marcus had coordinated search efforts during those terrible first days when the town still hoped Sarah Beth might be found alive, organizing volunteer teams and maintaining communication between various law enforcement agencies. His knowledge of local geography had been invaluable. He knew every back road, every creek bed, every abandoned building where a missing person might take shelter or where evidence might be hidden. More intimately, Marcus had been among the community members who comforted the Morrison family during their darkest hours. He'd helped organize the massive volunteer search that covered hundreds of square miles of East Texas countryside, coordinating with church groups and civic organizations to ensure every possible location was examined. When Sarah Beth's body was discovered at Willow Creek, Marcus had been one of the first responders, helping to secure the crime scene until detectives could arrive from Austin. The photographs from Sarah Beth's funeral showed Marcus in the background of several shots, his face etched with the same grief and bewilderment that had consumed the entire community. He'd served as a pallbearer, his strong hands helping to carry the casket of a young woman whose life had been cut short by incomprehensible violence. In one particularly poignant image, He was captured embracing Linda Morrison outside the Methodist church, offering words of comfort that she would remember for years afterward. Marcus's reputation in Millerville was unassailable. He coached youth baseball for 15 years, his patient instruction helping dozens of local children develop both athletic skills and character. Parents trusted him implicitly. His teams always had the best safety records, the most inclusive atmosphere, and the strongest emphasis on sportsmanship over winning. When young players struggled with personal problems at home, they often confided in Coach Fielding, who had a gift for listening without judgment and offering practical advice. His marriage to Carol was considered a model of small-town stability. They'd weathered the usual challenges of raising children on modest incomes, supporting each other through career transitions and family illnesses with the kind of partnership that inspired younger couples. Their 3 children, Michael, Jennifer, and David, had all graduated from Millerville High School and gone on to successful careers, though only Jennifer had remained in town to raise her own family. The Fielding family attended the Methodist Church faithfully, occupying the same pew for over 3 decades. Marcus served as a deacon, helping with everything from youth programs to building maintenance. His quiet faith was the kind that expressed itself through actions rather than words. He was always the first to volunteer when elderly parishioners needed help with home repairs, and his pickup truck was a familiar sight, outside the homes of widows who needed groceries or transportation to medical appointments. In the immediate aftermath of Sarah Beth's murder, Marcus had been particularly attentive to the Morrison family's needs. He'd organized work crews to maintain their property when Robert Morrison was too consumed with grief to handle basic household tasks. He'd checked on Linda regularly during those first awful months, bringing supplies and offering practical assistance that allowed her to focus on supporting the investigation. His presence had been a source of comfort during a time when the family felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of their loss. When Sheriff Mitchell knocked on Marcus Fielding's door that March morning in 2024, she was about to arrest a man whose reputation for integrity and service had never been questioned in 37 years of community involvement. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, but the psychological reality was almost impossible to process. How could someone who had devoted his life to protecting others have committed such a horrific crime? How could the man who had comforted Sarah Beth's family have been responsible for their devastating loss? The arrest of Marcus Fielding sent shockwaves through Millerville that reverberated far beyond the immediate family and friends who thought they knew him best. Sheriff Mitchell had insisted on conducting the arrest early in the morning, hoping to minimize the spectacle. But in a town of fewer than 3,000 people, news travels faster than any attempt at discretion. By noon, the story had reached every corner of the community, leaving residents to grapple with the incomprehensible reality that one of their most trusted citizens had been living a lie for nearly 3 decades. Carol Fielding's world collapsed in the space of a single conversation. Sheriff Mitchell had arrived at the house prepared to handle Marcus's arrest with professional efficiency, but she hadn't anticipated the secondary trauma of watching a 65-year-old woman confront the possibility that her husband of 37 years was a murderer. Carol's initial response was complete denial, insisting that some terrible mistake had been made, that the DNA testing had somehow been contaminated or misinterpreted. Her voice carried the desperate quality of someone trying to argue with reality itself. But as Sheriff Mitchell explained the scientific certainty of DNA evidence and the rigorous chain of custody that had been maintained, Carol began to remember details that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on sinister new meaning. October 12, 1996. The night Sarah Beth Morrison disappeared, Marcus had returned home unusually late from the county fair. He'd claimed he'd stayed to help with cleanup and breakdown of the volunteer booths, but Carol now recalled that his clothes had been muddy and that he'd immediately thrown them into the washing machine. Unusual behavior for a man who typically left his work clothes in a hamper for weekend laundry. More disturbing was Carol's recollection of Marcus's behavior in the days following Sarah Beth's disappearance. While the rest of the community had been consumed with worry and confusion, Marcus had seemed almost preternaturally calm, taking charge of search efforts with an efficiency that had impressed everyone at the time. Now Carol wondered if his detailed knowledge of where to search, and more importantly, where not to search, had come from guilty knowledge rather than logical deduction. The investigation team that descended on Millerville following Marcus's arrest worked with methodical precision, re-interviewing witnesses from 1996 and asking questions that hadn't been relevant when Marcus was considered a helpful community member rather than a suspect. What emerged was a pattern of behavior that had been hiding in plain sight for 28 years, camouflaged by the very reputation for helpfulness and community service that had made Marcus above suspicion. Janet Wilkins, who had worked the Methodist Church's booth at the 1996 county fair, remembered seeing Marcus talking to Sarah Beth near the cotton candy stand around 8 o'clock that evening. At the time, she'd thought nothing of it. Marcus knew everyone in town, and it was natural that he would speak with one of the elementary school teachers, but now she recalled that their conversation had seemed more intense than casual, that Sarah Beth had appeared uncomfortable, even distressed during their interaction. Even more significant was the testimony of Tom Bradley, a retired volunteer firefighter who had worked closely with Marcus during the search efforts. Bradley remembered Marcus suggesting specific areas to search and, more importantly, areas to avoid. At the time, Marcus's recommendations had seemed based on his superior knowledge of local geography and his experience with emergency response. In retrospect, Bradley realized that Marcus had systematically steered search teams away from the area around Willow Creek, claiming it was too remote and unlikely to yield useful information. The re-examination of physical evidence yielded additional revelations that had been overlooked in 1996. The careful placement of Sarah Beth's car keys on the Henderson property fence post had suggested someone with intimate knowledge of local routines and geography. Marcus Fielding had driven past that exact fence post twice daily for over a decade, while traveling between his home and the fire station. He would have known that Mrs. Henderson jogged that route every morning, and he would have calculated exactly how long it would take for the keys to be discovered. Perhaps most chilling was the revelation that Marcus had been present during several crucial phases of the investigation. His position as fire chief giving him access to information that allowed him to stay one step ahead of law enforcement efforts. He had attended briefings with Sheriff Rawlings and Detective Santos, learning about evidence collection procedures and investigative theories that enabled him to avoid detection while maintaining his helpful facade. The psychological profile that emerged painted a picture of a man capable of compartmentalizing his life to an extraordinary degree. Marcus had continued his community service activities, his family relationships, and his church involvement without apparent disruption, even as he carried the secret of Sarah Beth Morrison's murder. His ability to comfort Linda Morrison, while knowing he was responsible for her daughter's death, suggested a level of emotional detachment that mental health professionals found deeply disturbing. As news of the arrest spread beyond Millerville, the case began attracting national attention. Crime podcasters and true crime enthusiasts seized on the story of a small-town pillar of the community who had hidden in plain sight for nearly 3 decades. The narrative seemed to confirm every paranoid fear about the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface of seemingly perfect communities, where trust and familiarity created blind spots that allowed evil to flourish undetected. The Millerville County Courthouse had never seen anything like the media circus that descended upon the small town in the weeks leading up to Marcus Fielding's arraignment. Satellite trucks lined Main Street, their towering antennas casting shadows across the courthouse square where Sarah Beth Morrison had once walked as a child, feeding ducks in the small pond that now reflected the harsh lights of television cameras. National news networks had picked up the story of the trusted community leader who had hidden his horrific secret for 28 years, transforming Millerville from an anonymous East Texas town into a symbol of betrayed trust and delayed justice. Linda Morrison, now 79 years old, sat in the front row of the courtroom on the morning of March 15, 2024, her weathered hands clutching a framed photograph of Sarah Beth taken just weeks before her murder. The image showed her daughter in her classroom, surrounded by smiling second graders, the kind of picture that had sustained Linda through nearly 3 decades of grief and determination. Today, for the first time since that terrible October night in 1996, she would face the man who had taken her daughter's life, who had comforted her family while carrying the weight of his unspeakable crime. Marcus Fielding entered the courtroom in shackles, His orange jail uniform a stark contrast to the pressed suits and volunteer firefighter dress uniforms he had worn during decades of community service. At 67, he appeared to have aged dramatically in the weeks since his arrest, his shoulders stooped and his once confident bearing replaced by the shuffle of a man whose carefully constructed world had finally collapsed. The transformation was so complete that several long-time residents later admitted they barely recognized the man they had trusted with their children's safety and their community's well-being. The arraignment itself was a formality, but the psychological impact on the courtroom was profound. When Judge Patricia Summers read the charges aloud, murder in the first degree, aggravated sexual assault, tampering with evidence, Linda Morrison felt the words echo through her body like physical blows. For 28 years, these accusations had existed only in her imagination, in the theories she'd developed during sleepless nights and the scenarios she'd discussed with detectives. Hearing them spoken officially, directed at a specific person she had known and trusted, transformed abstract concepts of justice into concrete reality. Marcus's attorney, David Chen, a criminal defense specialist from Dallas, entered a plea of not guilty, setting the stage for a trial that would force Millerville to confront uncomfortable truths about how well anyone truly knows their neighbors. Chen's strategy became apparent during his brief statement to the media following the arraignment. He would challenge the DNA evidence, question the chain of custody, and argue that 28 years was too long for memories to remain reliable. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney Rebecca Torres, possessed evidence that went far beyond the original DNA match. The renewed investigation had uncovered a pattern of behavior that painted Marcus Fielding as a predator who had used his position of trust to access potential victims. 3 other women had come forward since his arrest, reporting inappropriate behavior and unwanted advances that they had been too intimidated to report at the time, given Marcus's standing in the community. The most damaging revelation came from Marcus's own family. His daughter Jennifer, struggling with the devastation of learning her father's true nature, had reluctantly shared information that provided crucial context for the prosecution's case. She remembered her father's obsessive interest in crime shows and forensic science programs, his detailed knowledge of police procedures that had seemed like harmless curiosity at the time. More significantly, she recalled finding newspaper clippings about Sarah Beth's murder hidden in her father's workshop, along with other articles about unsolved crimes against young women across East Texas. The discovery of these clippings in Marcus's possession suggested a level of premeditation and ongoing fascination with his crime that prosecutors argued demonstrated the calculated nature of Sarah Beth's murder. The fact that he had preserved these mementos while maintaining his facade of community service indicated a psychological profile consistent with organized serial offenders, even if Sarah Beth was his only known victim. As the trial date approached, the psychological toll on Millerville's residents became increasingly apparent. Longtime friends and neighbors found themselves questioning decades of shared memories, wondering which interactions with Marcus Fielding had been genuine and which had been performed by a man capable of unspeakable violence. Parents who had entrusted their children to his baseball teams struggled with guilt and fear, while church members grappled with the theological implications of evil hiding within their congregation. Carol Fielding's situation was perhaps the most tragic of all. Married to Marcus for 37 years, she faced the impossible task of reconciling the man she had loved and trusted with the monster revealed by DNA evidence. Her decision to testify for the prosecution, providing details about Marcus's behavior on the night of Sarah Beth's murder, represented a choice between loyalty to her husband and justice for a young woman whose life had been stolen. The weight of 28 years of waiting settled over the courtroom like a physical presence as the trial began. Linda Morrison, surrounded by family members and supporters who had sustained her through nearly 3 decades of advocacy, finally saw the possibility of answers to questions that had defined her adult life. But she also understood that no verdict could restore what had been taken from her family, that justice delayed is a fundamentally different thing than justice served. The confession came on the 3rd day of testimony, when the weight of evidence had finally crushed Marcus Fielding's carefully maintained facade beyond repair. District Attorney Torres had methodically presented the DNA evidence, the witness testimonies, and the timeline that placed Marcus at every crucial point in Sarah Beth Morrison's final hours. When Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, the prosecution's forensic expert, explained to the jury how modern DNA analysis could identify individuals with astronomical certainty, Marcus's attorney recognized that their defense strategy had become untenable. Marcus Fielding's decision to confess wasn't born from remorse or a sudden attack of conscience. Court observers noted his mechanical delivery, the absence of emotion as he described the events of October 12, 1996. His voice carried the flat tone of someone reading a grocery list as he admitted to following Sarah Beth from the county fair, using his knowledge of her routines and his position of trust to approach her without raising suspicion. He had offered to help her with car trouble, a lie that allowed him to get close enough to overpower her before forcing her into his truck. The details Marcus provided filled in the horrifying gaps that had haunted Linda Morrison's imagination for 28 years. Sarah Beth had fought desperately, he admitted, but his physical strength and the isolated location he'd chosen had made resistance futile. The severing of her finger had been an attempt to remove a distinctive ring that might have connected him to the crime, though he'd panicked and abandoned the appendage rather than disposing of it properly. His description of moving her body to Willow Creek and carefully placing her car keys on the Henderson property fence post revealed the calculated nature of his cover-up. Perhaps most chilling was Marcus's admission that he had volunteered to help with search efforts and comfort the Morrison family, specifically to monitor the investigation and gauge how close authorities were getting to identifying him. Every expression of sympathy he'd offered Linda Morrison, every hand he'd placed on Robert Morrison's shoulder, every prayer he'd spoken at Sarah Beth's funeral had been performed by a man who knew exactly where her body lay and how she had died. The courtroom fell silent as Marcus described the psychological compartmentalization that had allowed him to maintain his double life for nearly 3 decades. He spoke of his crime as if it were a separate entity from his identity as husband, father, and community leader, claiming that the man who had murdered Sarah Beth Morrison was somehow distinct from the man who had coached Little League and served as fire chief. Mental health experts would later describe this level of dissociation as consistent with certain personality disorders, but for the families affected by his deception, such clinical explanations provided little comfort. Linda Morrison's reaction to the confession was not the cathartic release that observers might have expected. Instead, she described feeling a profound emptiness, as if the energy that had sustained her 3-decade quest for answers had suddenly been drained from her body. The truth she had fought so long to uncover was somehow smaller and more banal than the mystery that had consumed her life. Not the work of a sophisticated criminal mastermind or a stranger passing through town, but the calculated violence of a neighbor who had hidden in plain sight. The impact on Marcus's own family was devastating in ways that extended far beyond the courtroom. His 3 children faced the impossible task of reconciling their memories of a loving father with the reality of his monstrous actions. His 7 grandchildren would grow up carrying the burden of their grandfather's crimes, forever marked by a surname that had become synonymous with betrayal and violence in their small community. Carol Fielding's testimony about her husband's behavior in the days following Sarah Beth's murder provided the final pieces of the prosecution's case. Her description of Marcus washing his clothes immediately after returning home, his unusual calmness during the search efforts, and his obsessive interest in the investigation's progress painted a picture of a man who had committed murder and then spent 28 years waiting to be caught. The trial's conclusion brought no sense of celebration to Millerville, only a weary acknowledgement that some wounds never fully heal. The town that had been defined by its sense of safety and community trust now carried the knowledge that evil could flourish undetected among them for decades. Parents looked at coaches and teachers with new wariness. Neighbors questioned the reliability of their own judgment, and the easy familiarity that had characterized small-town life became complicated by the understanding that anyone could be hiding unspeakable secrets. Sheriff Mitchell, whose decision to reopen the case had finally brought justice for Sarah Beth Morrison, reflected on the broader implications of the investigation during her press conference following Marcus's sentencing. The technology that had made the arrest possible, advanced DNA analysis and expanded criminal databases, offered hope for other families waiting for answers about their own unsolved losses. But Mitchell also acknowledged the sobering reality that for every case that eventually finds resolution, others remain forever locked away in evidence rooms, their secrets carried to graves by perpetrators who never face consequences for their actions. The Sarah Beth Morrison case had become a testament to the power of persistence, the advancement of forensic science, and the ultimate triumph of truth over deception. But it had also revealed the terrible price that communities pay when trust is betrayed by those they hold in highest regard. As Millerville began the long process of healing from this revelation, residents carried with them the uncomfortable knowledge that their sense of safety had always been, to some degree, an illusion, and that the difference between victim and perpetrator might be nothing more than proximity to someone capable of unspeakable evil. If you followed Sarah Beth Morrison's story to its conclusion, you understand why some secrets should never be kept, and why the pursuit of justice sometimes requires decades of unwavering determination. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for more investigations into the cold cases that remind us that truth, however delayed, can still find its way to light.